Have you ever wondered how biostasis works? Let us guide you through it. Medical biostasis is an advanced technology that aims to give you the best chance to live much longer than what is currently possible. But why do people want to live longer? Some people just love life and want to experience it for as long as possible. Some people are just curious about the future. They want to see what future cities will be like and what humanity will be able to achieve. Others think the world would be better and more fair if the length of your life was your own choice. There is no doubt that you will ever run out of things to do in a multifaceted world like the one we live in. In the end, the motivations are plentiful. But how can someone sign up for biostasis? First, you simply sign up with us and our insurance partner. It just takes a few minutes. To start, we only need some personal information. Don't worry, it's a simple process and we will guide you through every step of the way. Biostasis is achieved with the help of cryopreservation. Cryopreservation is a very advanced procedure that's still rather expensive and therefore not widely available. Tomorrow offers high-quality cryopreservation with prices starting from €100,000 and going all the way up to €400,000. Of course, this is a lot of money that few people can easily afford. But there is a solution. Together with our big-term life insurance partner, we offer a subscription model which brings the cost down to only €30 a month. About 90% of all biostasis contracts are funded via a term life insurance model. Let's say you're 30 years old and you want to sign up. The first thing you need to do is sign up with Tomorrow Biostasis, and we automatically contract with our term life insurance partner for your coverage. Now, should you pass away during the coverage period, the term life insurance will cover 100% of the cryopreservation cost. You are protected from day one. Should you pass away after the coverage period, then unfortunately the term life insurance will not cover the cryopreservation cost. But of course there are other funding options for this situation as well. We make sure that our customers have everything in place well in advance. Furthermore, there is a high chance that prices will come down significantly in the future, as we work consistently to reduce the cost of a high-quality cryopreservation. Congratulations! You are now fully signed up. Now, should anything happen to you where current medical technology can't save you, like a terminal heart disease, cancer, or whatever it might be, and the worst case happens and you should die, our team stands ready to pick you up and bring you to a medical research institute that is equipped for cryopreservation. Cryopreservation is an advanced procedure that uses medical cryoprotectant solution and very low temperatures to protect your body, and most importantly your brain, the part that makes you, against degradation. We keep you safe and sound for however long it takes until medical technology will be advanced enough that revival is possible. While we can't guarantee, that is arguably better than any other option. Then, once technology makes it possible, we will revive you. Should you have gotten cryopreserved at an old age, then revival will only be done once rejuvenation technology is available and the human lifespan is much longer than it currently is. Sometimes people are worried that life in the future might not be as enjoyable as it is today. But if history has shown us anything, it is that the average quality of life keeps getting better during the years. Now, after revival, you are free to continue your life as fit and happy as ever. Of course, this is a complex topic where a short video doesn't really do it justice. We are more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Just reach out to us. Find out more.
Welcome everybody to tonight's Tomorrow Bio webinar. I'm Emil, founder and CEO of Tomorrow Bio and also the president of the board and a trustee at the European Biostasis Foundation. And I'll today walk you through what you can do to improve the quality of your cryopreservation. Right? Of course, in the past we've talked about a lot of topics, what we're doing, what research can do, what the SST teams, what the doctors can do. And the question now is what you can do, what you can improve. Of course, there's only so much that the quality can be improved from each individual person, but there's a couple of things that do work. We need a couple of seconds until the next slide is ready. One more thing. Yeah, now we can actually move to the next slide. Quickly to introduce myself again. I'm a doctor by training, then did a lot of tech companies in the past. And now, as I said, I'm running Tomorrow Bio, the European Biostasis Foundation. And I also am a co-initiator of CryoDAO, an organization that basically funds very basic research in the field of cryopreservation. As I said, today it's about improving your cryopreservation. Where do you have the impact? What you can do? And of course, as always, this is not only me talking, but it's supposed to be a very interactive webinar. So I'll give a half-hour introduction or so, and then I'm more than happy to answer all your questions. So here on the screen right now, you see a QR code. Scan that QR code. You're gonna get to a page called Slido, or just enter sli.do in your web browser, and then this code that you see here on the screen, and then I'm more than happy to go through all the questions in the end. Ideally, put all questions in Slido. I'm going to prioritize the questions on Slido in the end, but for whatever reason, that doesn't work, you can also put them into YouTube chat. It just makes it a bit more difficult to figure out which question has already been answered. And one important topic, in Slido you can upvote and downvote questions, so if you feel like one question is of particular interest, then upvote it, and then I'm going to go by these votes in the end to make sure that every question that a lot of people are interested in gets answered. Well, now, without further ado, let's start with the basics. Basically, we separated this kind of webinar into two main parts. What is the basic stuff that we would strongly recommend everybody should do, and everybody should make sure that these things are in place. And then more advanced stuff for people who want to dig a bit deeper, which also usually would involve at least some amount of money or some amount of at least resources allocating and time allocation to make those happen. So this is more for people who really want to make sure they get the very, very best cryopreservation and are willing to put a good amount of time and effort and money into it. But the basics, these are the things that everybody should do. Before starting, one thing that everybody should always be aware of: the best possible cryopreservation, the biggest factor is probably to have the cryopreservation with the very best technology. So basically the last possible technology, or basically be able to be cryopreserved with the best technology which will exist in the future. So living healthy and living as long as possible is probably the best factor, or the best determinant of a good cryopreservation. Apart from that, when you sign up with us, right, you've signed your cryopreservation agreement, you've signed a body donation agreement, you've signed everything that is required to do a cryopreservation. For everybody, all of our members get an additional last will sent. And the last will is technically not required for cryopreservation, at least in Europe, but we would strongly suggest and strongly recommend to fill out a last will form. Basically, it's similar to the cryopreservation body donation agreement, where you state, I would like to donate my body, I would like to be cryopreserved should I die. It's just in a form, in the last will form, which is usually either handwritten, or it is signed, basically printed, signed, and then notarized. But that depends. There's some differences by country. But it basically gives your wish to be cryopreserved a higher level of legal security, so to speak. So not only set up a last will, but make sure the last will is always up to date. Only, again, in pretty much every country that I'm aware of, and pretty much every jurisdiction that I'm aware of, only the newest last will is being considered. So make sure that should you update it at any point in the future, if at that point, I assume you still want to be cryopreserved, make sure that the wish to be cryopreserved is still in that last will. As I said, we're sending around a version, like basically not really a template, but like a text that you can use as your last will. You can also add that text to an existing last will. And if you want to check out the newest version, then go to tomorrow.bio/documents, where you find those documents to download at any point. And if anything legally changes, or there's any change on our end, then we're always updating the version that you find online. And if there's a major update, we of course are we're gonna notify all of our members to make sure that they're protected. The second document that we would strongly suggest to create is a so-called Patient Advance Directive. A Patient Advance Directive is again not necessarily required to make sure that the cryopreservation can be done in principle, but it is very, very helpful for two things. One, if you are not conscious anymore and you're being brought to a hospital and none of your next of kin is there, no one is aware that you would like to be cryopreserved, the doctors are not necessarily looking, of course, for cryopreservation membership cards or anything like that. But doctors usually ask for patient advance directives. Right? So in that case, it might be the initial point where a doctor and the hospital staff would then be notified of your wish to be cryopreserved, and part of that patient advance directive is that they should please contact us so that we're aware that there might be a severe situation, there might be a disease, there might have been an accident that might lead to the patient's death soonish, and the patient advance directive would then A, inform us, and B, it gives us a certain amount of rights to get information from the doctors, right? Usually, since of course we're not next of kin, doctors are not practically allowed to talk to us without patient approval. So the patient advance directive, in the case when the patient is not conscious, gives us the right to talk to the doctors, and you can also give us additional rights. The getting information from the doctors is the important part here. So again, go to tomorrow.bio/documents and download the newest version, and then send that version just as similar to the last will. Send it to us. To make sure that if something happens to you, we have all the documentation that helps us, make decisions and reach you as soon as possible. The next broader point, whereas of course a contract and the last will and a patient advance directive always have this point, okay, I would like to be cryopreserved. This is basically the main argument, the main fact from these documents. It does make sense to confirm that. Not necessarily if you signed up last year, this doesn't make necessarily super important, but let's say you've been a member with us for the last 10 or 20 years, right? Not yet, but at some point in the future, then it does make sense to once in a while confirm the wish to be cryopreserved. Because if there are any legal challenges at the time of your death, if you, let's say, parts of your family say, well, this person did never want to be cryopreserved, but we have a document, or another part of your family says, yes, they wanted to be cryopreserved, then as much documentation as possible is then helpful to make the case that no, cryopreservation was always the wish of the patient. So any type of documentation works, right? In document form, like just re-signing it, in video form, just sending us a video where you state that you would like to be cryopreserved and this is your wish, and you looked at the pros and cons and all of that. And last but not least, at some point we will probably also integrate it into our app. It's on the roadmap, but it's not one of the things that we're currently actively working on because there's higher priority things. But in the long run, that would also be something that you can manage in our app and in your user account within that app. Next topic would be the app in principle. It's currently in early beta, alpha/early beta phase. It is on the app stores, but we would strongly recommend, strongly advise to not yet use that app basically as a cure-all solution where you say, hey, I have the app, now everything else is safe, because there's still a lot of bugs and false positives and false negatives. But basically the goal here is to have an app that if someone dies without advance notice, right, which is luckily the less common case. In most cases, people are being diagnosed with diseases, let it be cancer or heart disease or whatever. The doctors will tell them that they have, let's say X weeks or a few months to live, and then the person who wants to be cryopreserved can tell us directly. But in cases where, let's say you're in a hospital and then you should die due to a complication or whatever it is, right? Or of course accidents or heart disease, heart attacks or something where there isn't much advanced notice, then of course we're not aware that there's a cryopreservation case or that we need to dispatch one of our teams. In those cases, the app is there that if there's, for example, no more movement data, if there's no more heart rate data from, for example, these Oura rings or other smart devices, then you can set the app up to send emergency notification to your friends, for example, who would then be able to contact us. So setting up the app, testing it now. We're going to open source it within the next couple of weeks and continue in the open source community to develop it and make it better. But setting up the emergency app would be like a piece of the puzzle to make sure high quality cryopreservations would be done should something happen to you. Next one, very important, inform your family and friends about the wish to be cryopreserved. In the case, and most important here would be your family, especially your closer family. So your partner, your spouse, your children, your parents, and so on. Because under certain circumstances, in standard, if there's no last will, right, and no wish to be cryopreserved, right, which of course is not the case if you signed up, but in the standard case, if someone dies, the closest next of kin, at least in most European countries, the closest next of kin can make the decision what happens in regards to burial and so on. And they will also be the one who would be able to decide that someone should be cryopreserved. Now, of course, if you signed up with us or any other cryopreservation organization, you have made that wish with this body donation agreement or last will. In this case, legally speaking, technically the family should, not technically, but also practically in most cases, it is clearly accepted that the family in these cases has no say of what happens. But of course, in the past, and it's also imaginable that that happens in the future, and I think in fact it will happen once in a while in the future, the family will strongly disagree and kind of try to fight it. If there are family members that are supportive and friends that are supportive and then can support your wish to be cryopreserved, that's very helpful. So informing your family members and then telling us who these supportive family members are, that's very helpful. And last but not least, it's very important to inform us about any other unique circumstance, whatever else there might be, that might be either positive or negative for a potential cryopreservation. So for example, would be if family members are very much against it, that would also be helpful to know, so that we kind of can, as much as possible, of course, manage that in some way or form. Of course, it's always important to tell us if you move to another country, if you're being diagnosed with some disease, if something happens that might have some impact on a potential cryopreservation. So you can just email that to us at support@tomorrowbiostasis.com. Whenever something happens, of course, not only now, but also in the future, always let us know if there's anything that you deem to be relevant to cryopreservation. Of course, you don't need to let us know if you've had a cold or anything like that, right? But if anything serious or half serious happens, let us know. And now, let's go to the more advanced topics. So all of what I said so far, last will, patient advance directive, informing us about what happens, like who of your family members or friends are supportive, who are not, if you have diseases, right, downloading the emergency app, all of that, we would strongly recommend that everybody should do that, right? It's not that much work to do. Of course, well, there's some work, but not too much. That everybody should do, and always keep, not only do now, but also keep up to date. In fact, we will once in a while contact all of our members and tell them, hey, please remember to do these things, right? And then down the line, and also a bit depending on how old our members are, we will tell them, hey, you haven't sent us a last will yet. Please make sure that you either do that or give us a clear indication that for whatever reason you can't or won't or whatever, so that we're aware what happens in these situations, right? For example, with the last will, who has the last will if we don't have it, and so on. All right, now with a bit more advanced topics. Again, here, these are not absolutely required, right? Meaning, the basic stuff, well, it's also sometimes it's not absolutely required. Cryopreservation can also happen without any of that, but there we would recommend doing it. Here with the advanced stuff, it's not necessarily yet a level where we would say we would recommend it, right? This is more if anybody wants to go above and beyond their own preparation and wants to, spend time and money, as I said before, to make sure that the cryopreservation in some cases might be a bit better, right? There will be a good amount of cases where doing something from this more advanced list will probably even not any impact. So these are more for edge cases might be the wrong word, but it's definitely not the most common case where anything from this advanced list will have a tremendous amount of impact. So one would be getting first aid emergency boxes or kits, right? We provide basically 2 emergency kits, first aid kits, where one is a bit simpler and more affordable, and then an advanced, or what we call an advanced emergency first aid kit, which includes one of those chest compression devices. Unfortunately, these chest compression devices are pretty expensive, somewhere in the 7,000 euro range, at least the ones that we use. So this whole box is currently, I think, in the 8,000 euro range altogether. We provide them at cost, but still, due to the material and most importantly this chest thumper, this automated chest compression device, they're relatively expensive. The advantage of having one of those is pretty much only helpful if a patient dies, is pronounced on site, for example, by a family doctor, and we're not around yet. And at the same time there's someone there. Doesn't necessarily need to be a doctor, can technically be a family member who then can start these initial cool down procedures and stabilization procedures. So meaning chest compressions, ice around the body, giving oxygen, if someone is comfortable, also giving medication and so on. Very important to state, nothing should be done before the patient has been legally pronounced. If there's any interference before legal pronouncement, it's possible that will delay the cryopreservation by a tremendous amount of time, since there might be an investigation and so on, and we would then only be able to take possession of the patient, of the body, once that investigation has been completed, which can take days, if not longer, right? So only ever start with anything in the first aid category after pronouncement or with approval of the currently attending doctor, right? So, of course, this first aid stuff is relatively advanced stuff. So due to that, we're more than happy to train people. So if anybody wants to say, hey, listen, I want to have one of these boxes in my apartment or in my house or whatever, right? Or I want to give it to a family member and so on and so on. Just reach out to us. We're more than happy to, first of all, provide one of these boxes, right? And then B, also train you, of course, free of charge, to make sure that people who have that box would be comfortable in using the equipment, are aware of how to use the equipment, and so on and so on. So probably, again, like within most cities in Europe or most regions, these boxes are not absolutely required, right? Will most likely be only in edge cases be required. But if someone lives, for example, in some very rural, far away area, then under certain circumstances it might make sense. Right, that is the emergency box. Then we're doing this anyway, starting local first aid or SST teams. Not necessarily full SST, but the first aid part of SST, so the initial stabilization, cool down, and so on. So I said in one of the talks I gave in this webinar before that, of course, currently all over the world, and including Europe, there's only a couple of professional SST teams. For us, there's one here in Berlin. We have a partner in the Netherlands. We're building one in Switzerland. So we have a couple all over Europe. But let's say you're in Spain or Portugal or south of France or wherever, right? In most countries, there are no professional teams, and there might be kind of volunteer teams, right? There's a pretty professional team in the UK. There's one in France is setting some stuff up. There's a couple of people also in Spain and Italy and so on. So there's a good amount of ongoing stuff, but most of these teams are not absolutely fully, I would say, ready and have had many cases and so on. So if someone says, hey, listen, in my city, wherever it is, right, might even be in Germany, where there is already, of course, professional teams, but it still makes sense, let's say you're in Frankfurt or Munich or somewhere relatively far away from us, where if something happens last minute, we would still be, let's say, 3, 4, 5 hours away, where it would make absolutely sense if there would at least be initial cooling, right? Again, this only helps under certain circumstances. If the person has already been pronounced and we're not around, right? Which of course is definitely not the goal, but in some circumstances can happen. In those cases, it would make sense to have an initial team who takes then, for example, one of these first aid kits that I just showed and starts initial cool-down procedures. It's not necessarily super advanced procedures, but initial cool-down, just putting ice on the body, moving the ice around, doing chest compressions, maybe giving oxygen, maybe giving medication if people feel comfortable to do that, would have a tremendous impact on the quality of cryopreservation. So if anybody is interested to start like a local team, right, or a local, society of chronics or whatever, then we're more than happy to support this. So of course this is a very unique individual thing of how much time people can put into and what they would like to do. But if anything in that larger realm of having a local association, team, gathering, whatever you name it, then we're more than happy to support that. Just reach out and we're more than happy to talk and see if there's something that we can do together. Local support in general is very, very important. Of course, Europe is, has multiple countries where even though most legal frameworks are relatively the same and most conditions are relatively not the same but similar-ish, there's still a good amount of differences. So let's say you're in, again, Portugal. We might have 8 members in Portugal. I don't know what the number exactly is, but it's definitely not 50. So currently, we of course look at what are the legal limitations in Portugal, what is legally required in Portugal to bring a body across the border, and so on and so on. So we do that work, but of course we can only do it, since we need to do it for every European country, we can only do it to a certain degree of complexity. And of course, unfortunately, no one here currently speaks all the languages that are being spoken in Europe. So one thing that you can do if you want to make sure that you have the best possible cryopreservation is try to build have a network of potential supporters. Usually the helpful people would be a supportive lawyer, a supportive doctor, ideally like family medicine doctor or someone in a hospital, and last but not least a funeral director. Of course, we have these networks as well and we build them, but partly we're relying on our community, on you guys, to help us build these networks, maybe find someone, maybe get a recommendation that someone is open to the topic, and then feel free to send these people to us, and we together can then build a database of potentially helpful people, supportive people, that then spans all of Europe. Next would be, of course, now we're getting into the pretty advanced territory as kind of the last step of what you can do. Would be moving to either closer to an SST team or closer to a facility. Of course, to be fair, this probably for most people is only possible at the time when they're being diagnosed with some disease where the doctors tell them, well, this might lead to the patient's death within the next couple of weeks, right? I don't assume that anybody can move closer to, let's say, Switzerland or Berlin or anything like that. Without any concrete reason that they might need to do that. But since SST and the time of when cooling starts and when the whole cryopreservation procedure or cryoprotection procedure more precisely starts has such a big impact on the final cryopreservation quality, being in Berlin, being in Switzerland, being very close to one of the existing teams or facilities has a tremendous impact. ALCO, for example, incentivizes that by paying relocation funds and so on. Of course, if you're in Europe and want to relocate to Arizona to Alcor for a longer period of time, due to visa limitations. That's not really possible. But within Europe, of course, it would be possible. So relocating to Berlin, for example, at least for anybody in Europe, that's a pretty simple thing to do, at least legally speaking. Of course, complexity-wise or logistics-wise, or like moving to another country potentially is pretty difficult. But at least legally, if something happens to you where a doctor tells you that you might only have X, months, weeks, whatever to live, then this would be a thing that would be possible. So if that ever comes up, feel free to reach out to us. We're currently in the process of reaching out to more and more clinics. Of course, this is a pretty slow process, but long-term the idea is that all over Europe, initially in Germany, then Switzerland maybe, then other countries in Europe, we have partnerships, in quotation marks, meaning with hospitals, meaning we would know a couple of doctors at that hospital, they're supportive of this topic, so then you know that you have a supportive infrastructure that you can rely on. But initially, moving to a city that has a team is very, very helpful. All right. Last but not least, I say that many, many times, reach out to us. We're more than happy to discuss all these topics. We're more than happy to provide more information about them. We're more than happy to, as I said, help you set up a local team, and so on and so on. So just feel free to reach out either by email or by scheduling a consultation. It says consultation, but that can be just talking to us about a certain topic. And last but not least, also just calling us is always a way to reach out. So feel free to do that at any point. Not only, of course, if you're already a member and are interested in any of or one of the topics that I discussed today, but also if you are still in the process of deciding, if you haven't signed up for cryopreservation yet, but you might be interested to at least learn, the pros and cons and how everything would work and so on, then absolutely do reach out as well. We're more than happy to talk and answer all the questions. And now, without further ado, I'm more than happy to answer all your questions that you currently have. So just as a reminder, go to slido, sli.do, enter this code or just scan the QR code to ask questions. And now I'm going through the questions, for as long as there are questions, basically. All right, first question would be, in my EU country, every person is an organ donor by default, unless explicitly against it. Is that a concern for me? Have you considered these situations? Yes, we have. So there are indeed some European countries, and probably over time there will be more and more making that change, where if you have not explicitly said that you do not want to be an organ donor, you are an organ donor. So organ donation, unfortunately, currently does not work together with cryopreservation. So if you are in a country that has that, you would need to sign on your organ donor card, I'm not an organ donor, or it might not be a card, but whatever the process is to say I'm not an organ donor, I would like to, in this contract you might of course then already have, I would like to donate my body to science, to cryopreservation. That would be something that you would need to do. The reason is that, of course, in principle, you could technically say, well, I would like to have my body cryopreserved, but my kidney, kidneys are already transplantable right now and probably replaceable rather easily in the future. My kidney, I would like to donate as an organ transplantation. That currently is not possible to combine these two things. Basically what happens, there are now two teams. The cryopreservation team says, well, I would like to cryopreserve this patient now, and the organ donation team says, well, this person is an organ donor and we need the organs for another patient. These two things unfortunately do not work together yet. So in those countries, you need to state that you're not an organ donor. And by the way, if I answer a question not fully or not comprehensively enough, or you have a follow-up questions, feel free to put that in as well. At the very end, once I'm through all questions, I'm gonna sort by newest questions and then follow up with those if there's any follow-ups. Next question would be, shouldn't biostasis and longevity research be a cooperative research field? Same goals, many rich people invest in longevity, but they rarely mention biostasis. Yes, very much so. And the older generation of people who are interested in longevity or cryopreservation, for them it was more one field. Now, of course, the longevity field has, over the last 10 years or so, gotten significantly more interest, right, and more money. And there's now a new generation of people, which, to be fair, if you talk to them in private, a lot of them are also very open to cryopreservation or even have cryopreservation contracts. But it's not so much a topic anymore that is being discussed. The reason why it's not so much discussed anymore is because what we now call the longevity field is a very, very broad set of things where on one hand you have supplements and wellness stuff, and on the other side you have like more high impact gene therapy. So to be fair, I think the longevity field, the word longevity field has almost gotten meaningless. It's now basically, a cancer company calls themselves longevity, which to a degree, of course, there also are, but also a supplement company, and at the same time you have, as I said, like gene therapy or genetic reprogramming or partial reprogramming company. So it's kind of like a catch-all term. They technically should collaborate, but the cryopreservation field is so much smaller that from a research allocation standpoint, it's almost, if someone puts money into the cryopreservation field, they might feel like the longevity field doesn't progress fast enough, because longevity, just taking a pill or doing a treatment, technically has the better value proposition than cryopreservation. We're very much working, so one of the reasons why I'm going to all these longevity conferences is kind of to move these two fields a bit closer together, which starts to work, I think. At least, as I said, a lot of people are interested in both. So let's see what the future holds here. All right, next question would be, do you have a counter-argument on the Ken Hayworth criticism about cryopreservation regarding the lack of proof of connectome preservation? I don't really have like a counter-argument. I mean, this is I think this would be too difficult to discuss or too long to discuss today. I think, so first of all, they have an argument, right? Like with their type of preservation, with this aldehyde stabilized preservation, they have shown that you can preserve ultrastructure very well. The vitrification-based cryopreservation field, so the standard cryopreservation field, has not shown that to that degree. There is a good amount of unpublished research, and I hope that will be published soon, in labs in the US, that shows there's also very good preservation data on the side of the vitrification field. But in regards to published data, there currently, there's a leg up. The problem, though, is that so certain types of preservation techniques, they cannot be done in every circumstance, right? For example, certain types of fixatives, which is required in the aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation approach, they're very difficult to give if there's already some amount of ischemia. In a standard cryopreservation case, unfortunately, and of course we're working, that's why we talk so much about SST and being fast there and so on, we're very much working on bringing ischemia down as much as possible, but currently there is just a relevant amount of ischemia in an average cryopreservation case. Now, and I think usually this argument is then extended to it, where I very much disagree, is that in cases that are not ideal, preservation should then not be done, or it doesn't make sense anymore. For me, it's very, very difficult, and I think it's almost impossible to say what will be inferable in the future. So, in my mind, cryopreservation should be done with the best possible technology and the best possible effort to get the best possible quality of cryopreservation. And there should never be a time when you say, well, now we're good enough, right? We should always push to the max. But if someone has chosen to be cryopreserved, I think it is their right, and then they are being cryopreserved with the best possible technology. There should not be a cutoff where you say, if we're not better than this quality level, then we don't do the cryopreservation. But in general, I think there's an argument to be made that it has not shown to that degree, as aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation has, that vitrification-based cryopreservation is, at least in published data. As I said, there's a lot of unpublished data that is pretty promising. There's an argument to be made here. All right, next question would be, being young and healthy, I expect I could die only due to an accident or violent death, both unlikely. How would tomorrow try to avoid compulsory autopsy? So, yes, if you're relatively young, dying of a disease and so on is relatively unlikely. It happens, unfortunately. There have been cases, unfortunately, in the past where people wanted to be cryopreserved and didn't sign up, then died due to some disease and then never were cryopreserved because they didn't sign up. But all of that is statistically pretty unlikely. The more likely case for young people is to die in an accident or something like that. In those cases, so basically when someone dies, the attending doctor needs to, on the death certificate, needs to either check this is a natural death or an unnatural death, right? Unnatural death means, accident, everything where there's not a clear logical chain of why this person dies. Logical chain would be the person has been diagnosed with cancer, then got, a blood infection, and so on, which in the end then led to the patient's death. If that doesn't exist, it can be ruled, or is usually ruled, an unnatural death. In those cases, there is usually, it doesn't necessarily need to be an autopsy, but there is at least an investigation which then can request or order an autopsy. If that is the case, we cannot do anything. We can advocate for it, in which we of course would. There is now in a good amount of hospitals who do so-called virtual autopsies, where you use imaging technologies, MRI scanners, CT scanners, and so on, to do virtual autopsies. But it's in that circumstance, we can advocate for it, and of course we will. But in the end, it is not our decision. So in that case, we can just try to get possession of the body as quick as possible with the least possible of interactions, like, for example, no autopsy, as possible, but it's outside of we're not allowed to make these decisions anymore at that point. Even if we have all the documentations, we can only advocate for it. Next question would be, you mentioned the app for detecting emergencies. How long before a notification is sent and what kind of testing have you done? Yeah, so you can set these things. So the app allows you to do basically and check it out and test it out yourself. It basically allows you to do two different types of emergency detection systems. One is time-based. Time-based means you just say, well, every 8 hours, every 6 hours, every 12 hours, every 4 hours, whatever you want, you get a push notification where then you need to say, well, I'm still okay. Right? Next 4 hours, next 6 hours, you can also disable the night, of course. You would get another push notification where it says, hey, are you okay? And you need to click it. Right? This, of course, is very low tech, but it works with every device. You don't need anything else, and so on and so on. Of course, this will not allow us to know that you might have died after 15 minutes, right? Because you probably don't want to click this button every 15 minutes. But at least it allows us to know that, well, 6 hours, 8 hours, which is in some cases already significantly helpful. The other thing is that it uses health data. Health data means currently, not in the version that is currently in the app stores, but the version that I'm, for example, currently have on my phone as the test version. It uses resting heart rate, it uses heart rate, and it uses movement. If any of those, if there's no movement, if there's no heart rate anymore, for example, from one of these Oura rings, then it sends an emergency notification. And how often it should check and how long it should wait until it then sends a notification, you can decide in the app. And the reason why you can decide that is basically to have a personal setting between false positives and false negatives, right? If you set it and, for example, then your Oura ring runs out of battery and for whatever reason you didn't move for the last 8 or 10 hours, right? Then there might be a false positive, even though, of course, the app does a lot of things to mitigate these false positives. Yeah, what kind of testing have we done? A lot, like different devices, Android, iOS, of course, but then also different smart devices, different time settings, and so on. But this is very much an ongoing project, right? As I said, we're going to open source this project, so this app will not only be usable for us, but for all other cryopreservation organizations as well, as an open source project, so that we can have the whole community continue to develop it and make it better. Because I think there's a good amount of stuff that works, but there's also a good amount of stuff that can be improved and should be improved. And I think in an open source project that makes the most sense. Hi Emil, when did you personally get into the field of cryonics? Is this something that has been on your mind most of your whole life or a recent interest? No, this has been on my mind for a good amount of time. So the general fact of like wanting to live significantly longer than currently medically possible has been on my mind since at least like 14, 15 or so. Because around 16 I decided to study medicine after high school, which I then did to do stuff long-term in longevity. That was the original plan. I then came to cryopreservation due to the fact that I feel like the field is not progressing fast enough. Both the cryopreservation field, but also the longevity field. I had a contract with Alco for many, many years. And of course now, whenever I'm in the US, I'm still an Alco member because we don't have teams there. When I'm in Europe, we would be responsible for me. And now in full time, I've been doing this topic since beginning of 2020. And kind of setting up, the foundation we set up in 2019. So since then, basically it has ramped up how much time I dedicated to it. And now, of course, since the beginning of 2020, it has been my full-time thing that I do basically, as a job and as a mission and as a long-term thing. Next question would be probably a very generic question, but what lifestyle choices in particular can enhance the cryopreservation later in life? So as I said in the very beginning of the talk today, live as long as possible. So live healthy to live long, to be then cryopreserved with whatever new technology will be developed in the future. More specifically, the only thing that probably increases, so there's a couple of things that would increase cryopreservation quality a bit. One would be very good cardiovascular system, right? So no plaques, whatever, like cardiovascular, good cardiovascular health is very helpful. And then not being overweight. Overweight, just the cooling rate goes down and so on. Operations are more difficult, right? Basically, if another doctor would say exactly the same if you would ask them how to live healthy, right? All of those things, there's nothing particular, at least nothing that we know right now. Maybe in the future there will be something more particular. For now, basically the high level point is live healthy. That's the best you can do from a health perspective, apart from all the other stuff that I said today. All right, next question would be, in a severe emergency, will you switch patients to chemopreservation? Will you remove the brain, break it into pieces to assist faster fixative diffusion? So, not necessarily, it's not really about the severity of an emergency or an accident. It's more about how much ischemic time has there been. So, long term, I think the cryopreservation field, or the preservation field in general, needs to move into where, based on how much ischemic time you have, and there might be other factors, but ischemia is currently the most important one, you do different types of preservations, right? So if there's very, very little ischemia, like let's say minutes, right, you can do vitrification-based cryopreservation, or you can do some aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation or chemical fixation. If there's a middle amount of ischemia, low amounts of hours, for example, to let's say, there are no clear cutoffs, but let's say to like low double digits of hours. In that range, you probably need to do, and when I say everything I'm saying right now is not really backed with like tremendous amount of good research data yet, so this is a bit speculative. Middle amount of ischemia is probably vitrification works better. And then high amount of ischemia, and when I say vitrification works better, I mean aldehyde stabilized perfusion with fixatives is not easy or possible anymore, but you don't want to go for immersion fixation yet because it takes time. So in the middle amount, you can still perfuse cryoprotective agent with some small changes in how you do it. But it is generally still feasible. Of course, it gets worse and worse the longer the more ischemia you have. And now, if you have a relatively high amount of ischemia, and again, like where the cutoffs are remains to be seen. If you have high amount of ischemia, you want to go for probably immersion fixation. Immersion fixation means basically the brain would directly be exposed to a fixative, and then the fixative would diffuse into the patient. In those cases, we would switch to immersion fixation under high ischemia cases, because just perfusion doesn't make sense anymore, and it might infect and probably does make it worse if you attempt fusion. We do not slice the brain. We do it as a whole. Which there's a paper recently a while ago from Ashwin and another author that currently I'm blanking on, published where how you would do that with some data of how much ischemia you add on during that fixation time. And we're currently running one research experiment of how fast this diffusion actually goes, right? First with a chemical fixative, and then also with a cryoprotective agent, because you want to do both before cooling down. So we do change the protocol, but exactly when and where will be decided in the future. Currently, it's a research topic. Next question would be, does ITS, which is intermediate temperature storage, which is basically storing the patient at, instead of negative 196 degrees, at negative 140 degrees about, does ITS offer poor slowdown of chemical processes degradation than standard liquid nitrogen temperature? No. For all intents and purposes, it's the same. In theory, of course, there is a change, but this is not meaningful. You need to remember that for every 10 degrees you drop the temperature, the metabolic rate halves, right? So you start at, let's say, 37 degrees Celsius, right? If you go down to negative 140, you have somewhere between, 17 to 18 halvings, right? Which is a reduction to basically, every second at that, at the current metabolic rate is now thousands and thousands and thousands of years of at that temperature. Now, if you would want to go down to negative 196, you would go another 5 halvings about further down, like less metabolic activity. But the difference here, we're talking about like tenths or hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years. So no relevant difference. You just need to go under the glass transition temperature. And depending on what cryoprotective agent you have, that's somewhere between, let's say, negative 120 and negative 130. So with negative 140, you're significantly relevantly under the glass transition temperature. So ITS storage has no difference in how much degradation usually, and the answer is you don't have any degradation in either case. Yeah, so no difference in that regard. Next question would be, do you believe that in the future perfusion will still be necessary? Couldn't we avoid ice crystal perfusion by simply reducing the body temperature fast enough? Yes, we could, but it's a very theoretical thing. We would need to reduce it so tremendously fast that it's like akin to magic. So I wouldn't know even how in principle this might work. So for a very significant amount of time, we will need some type of cryoprotective agent to do it. Next question would be, do you plan on publishing case reports like Alcor does? Absolutely. We will publish them, so technically it's legally speaking, but that's a detail. It's not really us, it's the foundation that publishes them. They will always publish on an annual basis for the year back, until we have a couple more patients stored, so that you can't easily figure out who's who, so that you can do it anonymously, and then they will be published at faster intervals. But for the time being, basically for every end of the year, is for the year that just has ended. Right, next question would be, can you estimate risk opportunity for below vitrification storage concerning application of synthetic biology to systems for storage and restoration? Can you estimate risk opportunity for below vitrification storage concerning application of synthetic? I'm not exactly sure what you mean by this question, so I would ask you to rephrase it again and post it one more time. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the question. But feel free to post it. I'm more than happy to come back to it. Just post it again. Next question would be, your fellowship program seems too good to be true. Aren't you losing money? Or are you estimating that some fellows don't actually end up becoming members? So for someone who doesn't know, the fellowship program currently works in the following way, right? You pay, so it's basically for people who say, hey, I'm not sure yet if I want to be cryopreserved. But I feel like this idea is super interesting, and I want to have kind of a close connection to the community, and I want to figure it out over time. Or they say, I definitely want to do it, but I just don't have the money yet to pay the 25. Like, let's say you're a student or a high school student or whatever, right? So then it works in the following way. You can sign up as a fellowship with us, which is €5, €5 that you pay on a monthly basis. For that, you have some perks like T-shirts and so on. You get a few things, but the additional things, and I think this is what the question alludes to, is for every €5 that you pay now, in the future, should you at any point decide to sign up, we give you €6 discount. Right. So now the question is, how do we lose money on that? So no, we don't necessarily lose money for a range of reasons. So one reason would be, well, there's inflation, right? So which of course might not offset the difference between €5 and €6. But let's say you do a year, you're a fellow for a year, and then we give you €6 discount. There's some amount of inflation where the €6 in the future is slightly less worth than when you paid the €5 right now. The more important point is that we want to incentivize people joining cryopreservation organizations, right? So this €1, we can easily take this out of our communication and PR and marketing budget and so on. So that's totally fine to basically give a bit of discount here for people who have been with us for a long time, and we want to also incentivize loyalty and for people who stay with us for a long time. So even though we might lose like €1 here and there, that's totally fine, can come out of the marketing budget. Next question would be, do you have a similar timeline for offering services in the US? We don't have a specific timeline yet. It is currently being planned. The goal is to go probably with the first regions, not all of the US. We're going to go city by city basically, with New York, or greater New York area, southern Florida being probably first, and then Portland, Oregon second, and then San Francisco Bay Area third. The goal is to kind of do it towards the end of the year, early next year, with the first regions, with like local partners, and then expand from there on out. There's no specific time frame, but it's definitely on the horizon. It's definitely definitely something we want to do, and we're looking into doing. All right, I'm going back to the questions that might have been posted recently. If there are no further questions, and I might briefly check YouTube as well if there's any questions that I might not have answered. If not, I would ask you to put in if there's any questions that you wanted to have answered and you haven't seen me answer yet. Put it in right now in Slido ideally, because that's going to be the last minutes of you having the chance. Let me quickly check YouTube chat if there's anything. Oh, okay, in YouTube chat there is, how many Alco members obtain the latest version of the Biostasis open source app? I don't know. No, we don't identify that, I think, and we're not actively tracking it. Also, it's not open source yet. It will be open source, so we're currently setting it up as an open source project. And by the way, if anybody wants to participate in that open source project as a developer, right? If they're an Android developer, iOS developer, anything like that, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy. We're currently building the team who then starts, and then of course anybody, since it's an open source project, can participate. But we're trying to get the first people involved. Right, more questions would be, do you think that cryopreservation and biostasis fixed with aldehyde will be better, offering higher quality in the future than the traditional one? It's a very difficult question. So it really depends. It comes back to the questions of how much ischemia you have. Under certain circumstances, at least it has the better published data right now. But again, there's unpublished data that vitrification is also pretty good, but of course it should be published, right? So it's kind of difficult to have like a definitive answer here. Under lower, like more ischemia cases, so where if the quality is down a bit, meaning there's more ischemia, or better yet, there's more ischemia, that's why the quality will be down. Under those circumstances, probably vitrification-based cryopreservation, the standard procedure, is better. So it really depends on where you are in the ischemia, how much ischemia you have. So wholesale, I think it's very, very difficult to answer. Again, like we will go for having different versions of what we do, different approaches, different procedures, different protocols, depending on how much ischemia there is. All right, okay, there's a few more questions. And again, now are the last minutes that you have, so if there's anything else, put it in right now. One more question would be, so would tomorrow help members change their organ donor status, or is this something that the members should do independently? Unfortunately, you need to do this independently because like different countries have different regulations, and those regulations change currently quite rapidly. We're more than happy to help, of course. So if someone says, hey, I don't know how to do it, feel free to reach out. Maybe we have a member that speaks the language who can check it out and help. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out. But in the end, it would not be something that we can do. It is something that the member would need to do. But if we can help in any way, feel free to ask. Next question would be, you must be optimistic for the future. Yes. Have you a philosopher supporting a positive vision for the future of humanity? We don't have a philosopher on staff, of course. I know a good amount of them, but it's not something that we have on site. And yes, I'm reasonably optimistic for the future. In fact, I'm very optimistic about the future. And of course, now you might say, well, this is unfounded optimism, which partly, of course, I don't know how the future will look. But I think there's one strong argument where you can at least estimate how good the future will be, or if the future will be good, and that is if you look into history, right? So if you don't look at the last 20 years, right, or last 10 years or whatever, where you might say, well, now is worse than the last 10 years. If you look 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 300 years ago, if you look at basically any human development index, like stuff like people living under the poverty line, child's death, people living with diseases, how much money people make, right? How much food security there is, right? And so on and so on. How old people live, like what's the average life expectancy, right? If you look at any of these numbers, and of course it's a zigzag line, right? So there are certain countries and certain times when this line does not necessarily go in the right direction for all of these metrics. But by and large, if you look at all these metrics together and look at long periods of time, we live in the very best time ever. For an average person, there has never been a better time where I would say I would rather live than right now. And I think the argument is reasonably strong that bar like existential risks like nuclear war or like AI or whatever there might be, right? Bar that, the future will likely be better than today. So I'm reasonably optimistic. I think there's good reason to be optimistic. Yeah. Right. Next question would be, how can someone effectively guarantee their cryopreservation in biostasis if their family or friends are against it? In that case, the solution would be having like a last will, having all these documents, having basically strong legal documentation that you want to be cryopreserved. It is your choice. Right? So you just need to be able, or better yet, we, if the case comes, we need to be able to prove it. So if you have a specific case where indeed all your family members are against it or something like that, feel free to reach out to us, and we're more than happy to discuss this topic individually. But high level it is, have it clearly documented. Have it documented with a notary. And so on and so on. Everything you can to create paper that says, I want to do it. Do a video that says, I want to be cryopreserved. This is my wish, and so on and so on. And then last but not least, of course, it would also be, just move closer to an organization. Let's say a family is in country A, and you move to Germany, to Berlin, if something happens to you, if you've been diagnosed with some terminal disease, or just if you get old, then where you kind of not, like far away basically, and you have all documentation, that would be the best way to do it. All right, last chance and last questions that I'm seeing right now. So feel free to ask the last minute question, and I think there are actually some. Wait, no, okay, last questions. Do you have planned some kind of social and solidarity fund to be able to cryopreserve people without sufficient financial resources? Long term, yes. So currently, unfortunately, cryopreservation is very expensive, at least if you want to do it with very high quality. There are some cryopreservation methods that are a bit more affordable, right? There are like small organizations that do brain-only cryopreservation at pretty affordable prices, even sometimes like sponsoring it fully. So I would like to be able to cryopreserve anybody who chooses for themselves, with informed consent, to be cryopreserved, right? I never want money to be the issue why someone shouldn't be able to be cryopreserved. Of course, at scale, that's not possible yet. But if these cases come up, feel free to reach out to us. Right? Sometimes there's donors who are willing to support cases and so on and so on. There are sometimes methods or like opportunities or chances to make a cryopreservation case happen, even if there is no or very limited funds available. I cannot guarantee that, of course, in any way, but if that happens to anybody, always feel free to reach out. If it's within our region, so Europe or Germany or something, where we can somehow do something, we're more than happy to help if we can. All right, this was today's webinar. So again, last but not least, I want to remind everybody again, for all these topics that we discussed today, if you want to get involved in any capacity or have any questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out to us, and we're more than happy to discuss with you in person. And now, thank you so much, have a great evening, and talk to you soon.